Insane asylums have been essentially banned in America due to inhumane practices. Apparently, they treated their patients even worse than people who were sentenced to death row. And so today we're checking out the most terrifying insane asylum experiments.
Let's start with the ones that were terrifying and slowly work our way towards the ones that were worse than death. Number 12, rotational therapy. Rotational therapy was heavily used in the US and Europe from the 18th to 19th century and had to be one of the worst experiments ever done in an attempt to cure mental illness.
Oh my God. What I'm just now clocking is that a lot of the treatments that they would do to patients was to try to help them. They were just trying to help. And back in the day, our medical practices were nowhere near as good as they are now. And it's sounding like, for this first one, to cure a mental illness, they would put you in a chair and just spin you around and around and around. I'm not sure what they thought would happen, but that obviously would not work.
Here, patients were placed on a chair, strapped in, and spun endlessly in circles. The speed would alternate every so often from a few turns to 100 rotations per minute. Now, of course, for the guy on the chair, this was absolute torture. But for the guy on the lever, this was a great way to tone the biceps. The spinning quickly caused patients to become so disoriented that they would continuously vomit.
Oh my
God. But if they were
God.
one of the lucky few, they would simply pass out and wake up feeling well rested. The reasoning behind the experiment was based on the belief that inducing nausea and dizziness through rapid rotation could reset the mind and calm patient.
But wouldn't you think like they would know if it worked or not after the first attempt? I mean, first of all, the whole idea of that is absolute nonsense. Like whoever came up with that had to be joking. They probably pitched that idea in a meeting and everyone was like, are you being serious or no? I can't really tell. And then somehow it worked its way through the woodworks and became an actual practice. But anyway, after they attempted it the first time and it didn't work, why would they keep on trying? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. At that point, the employees at the insane asylum were just trying to have fun and spin someone around and laugh at them.
Then, moral therapy. Now, at first glance, moral therapy doesn't sound too bad. After all, it's simply punishing a person in a way you see fit for doing something wrong or breaking the rules. Moral therapy was heavily used in insane asylums from the 18th to 19th century. Now, the real problem was that mental asylum patients weren't very good at following strict rules, since many of them would simply forget the rules or weren't capable of learning from their mistakes. So they would continuously be punished back to back to back, which I could only imagine must have been incredibly frustrating, since nobody likes to break a sweat at work. But let's cover the most common punishments that were given. Patients were severely beaten. They were tossed in cells for long periods of time and denied food. They were restrained. They were forced to eat an entire bag of circus peanuts. They received cold water treatment. And of course, they were placed on rotating chairs like we previously covered. Now, the real danger with this method was that workers could subject patients to whatever discipline they wanted.
Like, I don't understand how this happened at all because insane asylums are meant to cure people. Like, that's the idea. And that's kind of, I mean, that's the same thing with prisons as well. Like, prisons are supposed to, like, teach people how to be better in society, essentially. But insane asylums were specifically meant for people who were insane. And the whole idea of them was to cure them and then be able to hopefully send them back out into society where they would then be, I guess, quote unquote, normal. So I understand like doing some experiments on them, I guess you could say. For example, like one of them was they put them in a cold tub. I actually think that could be a good idea. There's a lot of studies that show like cold tub therapy is really good for your body. It's good for your mental health. But then other ones were just like, they got beaten to a pulp. They were starving for days. They wouldn't receive water. How would that help? All that would do is make the person go even crazier. I'm not saying that I have the answers. I don't know how to cure insanity, but certainly taking food away from somebody for multiple days, how would that help at all? All right, what's the next one?
Any given time with little oversight. Number 10, hydrotherapy. Hydrotherapy was yet another terrifying experiment that was used in the US and Europe from the 18th to 20th century. There were many methods, but I'll just cover the most common ones. Beginning with the bath of surprise. Patients were placed on a wooden bridge and told to walk across it. As they began to cross, a trapdoor would suddenly open, sending them free-falling into a cold lake below. This was supposedly designed to catch the person off guard in the hopes it would reset their mental state, which really goes to show that even in the darkest of places, there's always room for comedy. Next, the dunking baths. Patients were placed in a large cage, strapped in, and slowly submerged in a freezing cold lake.
Like this, this is gonna make them more insane. You're actually torturing them. Like people who get tortured will then have like PTSD afterward and they'll never be the same. And it's like, normally they're crazier after they get tortured. This is literally just making them even worse. I'm no expert, but my suggestion would be make them go for walks outside, make them go to the gym, give them some supplements like creatine, maybe some omega-3, eat vitamin D, just give them like nice, healthy things. Teach them, like put them back in school type of thing. I don't know. Like those seem way more reasonable to me to take someone who's crazy and make them normal than making them fall suddenly from a bridge into a freezing cold lake. I almost feel like the people running the insane asylums were also insane.
This was repeated until the patient was visibly on the verge of hypothermia, which was seen as a sign that the treatment was working. Then there was the wet towel treatment. Patients were tightly wrapped in ice-cold wet towels from head to toe and remained wrapped for hours. And finally, the long baths. Patients were submerged in water with only their head sticking out and left inside for hours or even days. Of course, eventually straps were added to keep them in place, since they couldn't risk anyone enjoying it. The reasoning behind hydrotherapy was the belief that water could induce relaxation, lower stress and anxiety, and promote healing. Today, we know that this only works when a person chooses to get in the water, not when another person tells you. Number 9. Solitary confinement. Isolation cells were heavily used in the US and Europe from the 18th to 19th century.
Solitary confinement is, I think, the worst punishment possible. That's essentially where you're in a black room, you don't talk, you don't see, you don't socialize at all with anybody ever. The only thing like that you get is to see or interact with anyone is there's somebody who will slip you food through the door. They won't even open the door. Oh my God, what just happened? But they won't even open the door and be like, hey, how you doing? Here's some food. No, they'll slip it under the door, or like there'll be a sliver in the door that they'll slip food through for you. That's the worst punishment ever. And they say like a lot of people will go insane because of how like lonely they are. Like they don't talk to anybody. Like humans need to socialize. And when you take someone like out of that, that will make them even crazier. It's just so insane to me, like that the treatments, quote unquote, are doing the opposite. It's like if there's a wildfire and then your idea to extinguish the wildfire is to start more fires. It makes no sense.
Patients were placed alone in a room and left there for hours or even days. And since many were suffering from severe mental illness, they often had no idea what was happening. Consumed by fear, some began to violently throw themselves against the walls in desperate attempts to escape, severely injuring themselves in the process. By the end of the 18th century, straitjackets had become widely available and were placed on patients before they were thrown into the cells. But again, the jackets didn't stop them from throwing themselves at the walls and getting injured, which really showed the workers. Not wanting to be made a fool of, asylums began converting isolation cells into padded rooms, which finally reduced self-injury, and patients could now be left inside more frequently and for longer periods of time.
I want to know if any of these ever worked though. Like he's telling us the craziest ones, and like if after he was done explaining them, he was like, oh, and you know what? This actually had like a 10% chance to work. I'd be like, all right, like that's a crazy method, but hey, at least there's a chance that someone got cured from it. I'm assuming that all of these were 0% success rate. And I can't imagine how they kept going and going and going with the same experiments when there's no way that it would work. What is this next one? This next guy is tied like inside of a chair. What is that?
Tranquilizing chairs. The tranquilizing chair was one of the most popular devices used in the US from the 18th through the early 19th century. Here, patients were placed in a chair and had their legs, arms, chest, and head tightly strapped down, preventing any movement. The chair was also equipped with a bucket to catch any human waste. A small box was then placed over the person's head, allowing them to see only what was directly in front of them. They were left alone in the chair for a few hours, but sometimes for as long as several days. Dr. Benjamin Rush was the man who invented the device. He believed that insanity was caused by disrupted blood circulation or sensory overload.
So that actually like makes sense to me. Like obviously this treatment is insane. Now that we know, now that we understand, like it's not going to work. It's just gonna make things even worse. But at least this guy, like I think like a somewhat reasonable like idea. But again, it's one of those things like maybe you try on 1, 2, maybe 3 people, and then when you realize that they all were not cured, stop shocking people for days on end. It's not working. Stop doing it. Although this is maybe really deep and dark and awful of me. However, I could see how it would be fun for the workers there to strap somebody up and just shock them over and over and over again for a while. I think I'm an awful human. I think that just concluded all of my suspicion my entire life of like whether or not I am a good or bad person objectively. And I think that concludes I'm a bad person.
So by preventing the patient from using their muscles, he thought all blood circulation would redirect to the brain and over time cure mental illness. Now, believe it or not, I was a victim of this method and miraculously lived to tell my story. When I was a kid, I was placed in one of these devices. My legs, arms, chest, and head were tightly strapped down. I vividly remember crying out to the world for someone to save me, only to have a device placed in my mouth, keeping it open and preventing me from screaming. Now, of course, once my teeth had been cleaned, I was unstrapped and let go. Number 7, restraint cages. Restraint cages were used from the 19th to 20th century, and they're exactly what they sound like. Patients were placed inside metal or wooden cages for long periods of time, in the hopes that they would take that time to reflect on their behavior or the bad decisions they had made. But the only issue was, the majority of insane asylum patients were not capable of doing that. So instead, they spent their time in the cages becoming more insane. Here's what the cages look like. Some were a bit larger, allowing the person to take a few steps, while others were so tightly confined that the person could hardly even move.
That is even worse than solitary confinement, which I said was the worst thing ever, but that's like solitary confinement plus claustrophobia. They're essentially in a coffin. Oh my God.
But get this, the time spent in these barbaric cages would depend on the severity of the patient's condition, meaning the crazier the person was, the longer they remained inside. Number 6, bloodletting. Anyone who's been around my channel should be very familiar with bloodletting, since I covered it in this video, but I'll touch on it quickly here. Bloodletting was one of the most popular and horrific medical practices in history, used in many countries from ancient times up to the early 20th century. Here, patients were poked with a blade to remove the bad blood from their bodies.
See, this one, I can understand where they're coming from. Like, now we know. Like, that's stupid, it doesn't work. But back then, it's like, you're sick, so let's try to cut the sickness out of you, essentially. Like, if you, for example, had the flu, the idea was the flu was in your blood. So let's cut and try to bleed out all of the flu. I actually understand that. Like, the thought of that actually does make sense. But again, I'm gonna re-harp on this point, which is that after the 3rd, 4th, 5th to the 100th patient doesn't get better, how does the practice go on for, I think, like hundreds of years? Bloodletting was a thing. They used to like drill holes in the brain. Like, that's where I'm losing the idea train.
Which was believed to cause illness. The severity of the patient's illness would dictate just how much blood was removed and how often. The worse you were, the more they drained. Since mental asylum patients were seen as very sick, it was recommended to drain them to the consistency of a raisin. But after a few sessions, it became obvious that the patient's condition was not improving. So naturally, doctors came to the logical solution to simply drain more.
Oh my God.
Which of course made things a lot worse, causing even more deaths due to infections and blood loss. Number 5.
Oh yeah, because back then they didn't really like clean the needles or anything. They didn't understand like that sanitization was a big importance. So they would just like reuse blood from other people and not clean the needles or the scalpels or whatever. And it's pretty crazy like how far we've come medically. I've kind of like talked about this before, but I still think that we have a very, very, very long way to go. Like the whole medical industry today, I think is still pretty messed up. I'm not saying it's worse than it used to be. Like back in the day, it was awful, really, really bad. But I think that in like 100 years from now and then 200 years from now, we're gonna look back at what we're doing today medically and think that like those people in 100 years will think that we were idiots for doing the practices that we're currently doing. Similar to how I'm looking back at, you know, a couple hundred years ago from now, and I'm like, dude, they were idiots. That doesn't make any sense at all.
Fever therapy. Fever therapy was commonly used in the US and Europe during the 20th century. Here, a patient would be injected with malaria to induce a high fever, sending the patient into a thrilling game of life and death for a couple of weeks. Now, if the patient was one of the lucky few who made a full recovery, they would be rewarded with another dose of malaria. inducing fever once again. This was done 8 to 12 times back to back, which means a patient could remain in an endless cycle of high fevers for around 6 months. But as the bodies piled up, doctors were forced to come to the realization that this method simply didn't work. Not because it was ineffective, but because it must have been injected into the wrong body part. So they began to inject malaria-contaminated blood directly into the person's brain. Over 1,000 patients received this terrifying treatment, and sadly, around 15% of them died directly linked to this experiment. The theory behind this was that many diseases were eliminated from the body after a person has a fever, so they figured that mental illness could also be cured the same way. Number 4.
I want to learn more about the patients, because we know like they're all mentally insane, but like I feel like each patient is different. Like there's so many different ways to be insane. You can be schizophrenic, you can be like Adam Beck. There's a whole bunch of different spectrums of insanity. And I want to know, like, how crazy are these people? Like, are they so crazy that like they're threatening society? Like, are they a menace to society where if you let them back in, they're gonna do harm to everybody? Because if not, like, let's relax a little bit here with the whole sticking needles into their brain and injecting malaria. Like, that's absurd. But if it is a person who's like actually so crazy and is like wielding a knife, for example, at all times and trying to kill everybody that he sees, all right, maybe inject that guy with malaria into the brain. But I feel like, I would imagine a lot of these guys are probably crazy, but not like absurdly insane, where you gotta be putting them in an electric chair and injecting their brain with malaria. I guess my point is, if you're going to that extreme to treat these patients, they better be like the craziest of the crazies, to where you have no other ideas, you have no other options but to try to jab their brain with one of the most deadly diseases of all time.
Insulin shock therapy. Insulin shock therapy, also known as insulin coma therapy, was used in many countries around the world, like the US, Canada, UK, China, and Korea, from the 1920s to the 1950s. Here, mentally ill patients were placed on a bed and were injected with large doses of insulin, causing them to become hypoglycemic and slip into a coma. But the scary part was that many patients would shake or thrash around so violently after receiving their injection that they would dislocate joints or break bones. After a few hours had passed, the patient would eventually recover and wake up, just to receive another dose the following day. This would continue on a daily basis for months. There was even a report of a patient who received this treatment for over 2 years. Now, surprisingly, many patients developed obesity thanks to glycogen storage disease, triggered by the daily insulin injections, which is just pathetic. Transforming their bodies by injecting, instead of achieving it the all-natural way. But sadly, obesity and seizures were not the only dangers. Some patients had it much worse. Many of them died while in a coma, or suffered severe brain damage. But believe it or not, doctors would take what they could get, and saw brain damage as an overall success.
I don't even know what to say to that. If you think that brain damage is a success, why not just take a baseball bat and clobber them in the head until they have like severe CTE, you know? Success, we have completely immobilized this person. He can no longer function at all, but he's still breathing, so he's better than he was before. That is essentially their conclusion.
After all, the patients completely stopped talking to themselves, or really to anyone ever again. The theory behind the operation was that comas were believed to be able to jolt patients out of psychosis and cure them from mental illness. Number 3, electroconvulsive therapy. Electroconvulsive therapy was heavily used around the world from the 19th to the 20th century. In the 1930s, 2 Italian psychiatrists named Ugo Cerletti and Lucio Bini observed that pigs would become extremely calm after receiving an electrically induced seizure. So they figured, why not try this on humans?
It was a pig treatment. It was for pigs who were being bad. They would just shock them until they were tame. And then they said, oh, let's try that on crazy humans, and then maybe they won't be crazy anymore. I'm pretty sure that's a weapon in Star Wars, by the way. I'm fairly sure I've seen that exact weapon in Star Wars. Maybe not. No, not Stranger Things either. There's definitely one show or movie where they use like electric spears very commonly, and I can't remember it.
On a patient who was suffering from schizophrenia, and just like the pig, the person woke up from their seizure completely relaxed. So the experiment was deemed promising. The news quickly spread, and soon doctors in psych wards around the world began experimenting with different machines and varying power outputs. But let's cover what the most common procedures look like. Patients were brought into a room, strapped to a bed, chair, chair or table. A rubber wedge would then be placed in their mouths to prevent them from biting off their tongues. Electrodes would be attached to their temples, and with a flip of a switch, the power was activated and the person was shocked. The electricity would eventually cause the patient to go into a seizure that could last for several minutes. But here's where things get even darker. Many of these patients remain fully awake during the entirety of the procedure, and I could only imagine the levels of fear that this would bring. The experiment would be conducted on a daily basis for weeks or even months, with some unlucky patients receiving multiple sessions per day. Electroconvulsive therapy was seen as being extremely successful, since most patients were so terrified of the procedure that they outright refused to do anything throughout the day, in fear of being punished and dragged back. The unlucky patients who received the treatment would live the rest of their lives with severe PTSD and were never the same again.
The ironic thing here is I would imagine that these insane patients would think that the doctors are the actual insane ones. Also, I wonder, like, do they just not have like pills back then, or like, any tablets or anything that they could just take and try to work that way? I think no. Thinking about it, I wonder like when pills were actually invented, because it seems like almost every single experiment, or healing practice had to do with like the physical body, whether that be bloodletting, whether that be electroshock therapy, whether that be cold therapy, whether that be whatever they attempted. It was all physical stuff. Like they never attempted to like make him drink oil, for example. So I'm wondering, like, maybe back then they had like no concept of giving them, for example, Tylenol, or giving them, anything that they just consume and digest to then help brain function, which we do now. We do have that now. I'm not sure what's better or worse, but we have it. We do have it. All right, what's number 2?
Trephination. Trephination was a procedure that was performed in many countries from ancient times up to the 19th century. Many people volunteered to have the procedure done, while others were forced. The procedure began by having the person sit in a chair or strapped down. Then someone would begin to drill a hole in their head. The holes varied in size, ranging from that of a small pencil to a tennis ball. The procedure was believed to cure chronic headaches and boost mental clarity by releasing unwanted pressure in the skull.
That does make sense. I understand where that's coming from. And I did mention this earlier, how like I knew that people would drill holes on the people's brains or whatever. I think that there's like no nerves in the brain. So essentially once they got to the brain, they could do whatever they wanted and the patient wouldn't even feel it, which is awful. Like that's actually absurd. But this is another classic case of when you try it on a couple patients and nothing changes, why are we still trying it? Like this, I think it's called Trephination. I think I used to call it trepidation, but I think that's a completely different word. Anyway, whatever the case, I'm pretty sure this practice went on for like hundreds of years. Like that is not a new thing that doctors invented for insane asylum patients. But I can't imagine that it ever worked ever. Like it's completely absurd.
Later on, during the 19th and 20th centuries, the procedure was brought into insane asylums and performed on patients. But this time, it was because they believed that a demon or evil spirit was trapped in the person's head, and the only way to help them was drilling a hole in the skull, allowing the demon to escape. Sadly, this was before the invention of the Ouija board, so simply asking them to leave wasn't yet an option. Many people who received the operation later died from infection. But of course, science moves on and the operations continued. Throughout history, people continued to experiment with different tools like drills, saws, and even hammers. The hole was even placed on every imaginable location on the skull. Then of course, some show-offs took it too far and began to experiment with different shapes. Number 1, lobotomies. Lobotomies are hands down the most terrifying experiment ever done.
Wait, I've heard of the word lobotomy before, but I'm realizing now I don't even know what does that mean? I feel like an idiot. Now I'm scared to know. Apparently it's the worst one. And we just got over the one where they were drilling holes in people's brains. So what is this?
Began in 1935 when a Portuguese neurologist named Antonio Moniz began to experiment on patients by drilling holes in their skulls.
Cool.
But it didn't end there. He then began pumping alcohol into the skull, completely destroying brain tissue. Thanks to the severed brain connections, the patient's behavior drastically changed.
That's right. Lobotomies are where they mess with the brain. That's what that is. Okay. It's all coming back to me now. I'm wondering why pouring alcohol in there was his first idea. Like, why not water? If you're going to pour liquid in there, you'd think like the miracle of life. The one thing that all life needs, water. Why would you not pour that in? I don't understand people, I guess. I don't know.
And the operation was deemed a success. But Moniz would take it a step further when he began to use a tool called a leucotome, which looked like this. He used it to sever and remove chunks of tissue from the frontal lobe, again, causing the patient's behavior to permanently change. Many patients would also lose the ability to move body parts, like their arms, legs, or even their face. Surprisingly, in 1949, Moniz won the Nobel Prize for discovering the lobotomy procedure, and many doctors from around the world began experimenting with it. Now, perhaps the most famous doctor in history to ever perform lobotomies has to be Walter Freeman, an absolute maniac. Freeman single-handedly performed over 4,000 lobotomies across the US from 1936 to 1967. Eventually, he created his own lobotomy method, not because it was better in any way, but because it was quicker. He called it the ice pick lobotomy, where he would insert an ice pick directly into the patient's eye socket, then hammer it into the person's brain, scrambling the person's frontal lobe.
Oh, I'm gonna throw up. I'm actually gonna throw up. And I don't think that oh my god, I can't even talk. Like, I can't even imagine. Oh my god. Oh my god. Oh my god. I'm like trying to picture that happening to me and it's just making me sick. I don't even want to think about that. It's so awful. The thing is too, I don't think that they had numbing whatever. And they had no anesthetics back then. So like they couldn't make people just go to sleep and then treat them while they're sleeping. I'm fairly sure these people were awake and were not numb to the pain.
How could he possibly know which part of the brain he was scrambling if he couldn't even see? Well, he liked to go by feel. And as you can imagine, many patients quickly died during or after the procedure. But for those who were lucky enough to survive, one thing was certain: they were never the same again. With many losing the ability to function independently. But here's where things get even crazier. Lobotomies became so popular thanks to Freeman's aggressive marketing and miraculous claims that regular people began to seek him out and pay for the operation.
Isn't this scary? How clearly awful of a practice that is. Yet it still became wildly successful. This guy was probably incredibly rich, and society was completely convinced that lobotomies were actually good. Now, I'm not gonna bring up anything like specific of today's world, but I just think it's a good mental practice. It's a good mental exercise, I should say, to think about how the world was less than 100 years ago. That was like 60 years ago, and how it is now, and see if there's any correlation, perhaps. There was a lot of propaganda back then, and there's certainly a lot of propaganda now about what is good, what is healthy, what is right, and I don't think that we're gonna really find out exactly how bad some things we're doing today are until, you know, 50 to 100 years later. But anyway, boys, that's it. If you guys do want to watch more, make sure to leave a like, subscribe if you're new, and click right here.